The Texas sun blazed mercilessly over Highway 281, its heat shimmering off the asphalt like a mirage, turning the horizon into a wavering dream. At mile marker 143, just beyond the rugged outline of Fortress Ridge State Park, traffic had ground to an inexplicable halt. No twisted metal or flashing emergency lights explained the delay, just a small, tawny figure standing defiantly in the middle of the road. A young bobcat, no larger than a house cat but with a wild, unyielding presence, stared down a line of idling cars. Horns blared, drivers leaned out windows, and a ripple of confusion spread through the standstill. The bobcat, later named Stella, paced with purpose, her golden eyes flashing as she darted onto the shoulder and back, as if daring the world to move her. Officer Laura Bennett, a 34-year-old veteran of the Texas Department of Public Safety, received the call at 2:17 p.m. 11 years on the force had hardened her to chaos, but a wildlife call like this was rare. Her patrol car's tires crunched against the gravel as she pulled up, her radio crackling with dispatch's bemused tone. Bobcat's got the highway locked down. Laura, good luck. She stepped out, her boots scuffing the sun-baked road, and adjusted her hat against the glare. Laura was pragmatic, her decisions grounded in protocol, but beneath her steely exterior lingered a shadow from her rookie days, a memory that clawed at her resolve. 7 years ago, she'd tried to save a fawn stranded on a highway much like this one. Her inexperience and eagerness had spooked the animal, sending it bolting into oncoming traffic. The sickening thud of its body against a truck's grill haunted her still, a moment that shattered her naive belief in harmony between humans and wildlife. She'd vowed never to let emotion cloud her duty again, and that vow now armored her as she approached the scene. Stella's movements were frantic yet deliberate, her lithe body weaving between the road's center line and the grassy shoulder. Laura crouched, keeping her distance, and raised her binoculars. The bobcat's fur was matted with dust, her ears twitching as if tuned to a distant call. Then Laura's breath caught a glint of blue plastic strapped to Stella's hind leg. Not a collar or tag, but something bulkier, out of place, an emergency locator device, the kind hikers carried, not wildlife. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't just a stray animal, there was a story here, one she wasn't sure she was ready to unravel. Laura radioed for backup from the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, her voice steady despite the unease creeping up her spine. While waiting, she studied the scene. The highway was flanked by dense thickets and limestone outcrops, the park's wild heart stretching beyond. Motorists watched, some filming with their phones, others shouting for the damn cat to move. Stella ignored them, her focus unbroken, emitting low, urgent yowls that sounded almost human in their desperation. Laura's mind flashed to the fawn again, its wide, terrified eyes, its fragile legs stumbling. She shook it off, forcing herself to stay present. This wasn't about redemption. It was about doing her job. 30 minutes later, a dust-covered Jeep pulled up, and Dr. David Carter stepped out, a wildlife biologist with weathered hands and a calm demeanor. David had spent decades studying Texas's fauna. His graying beard and sun-creased eyes spoke of years in the field, but his voice carried a quiet urgency as he joined Laura. "That's no ordinary bobcat," he said, squinting at Stella. He borrowed Laura's binoculars and zeroed in on the device. "That's a hiker's emergency beacon. TM7734 matches a missing person report." He pulled out his tablet, scrolling through data. Thomas Reed, 42 wildlife rehabilitator from Austin, went missing 3 days ago after failing to check in at Fortress Ridge. Laura's stomach tightened. A missing hiker, a bobcat with a beacon, this was no coincidence. David explained that Thomas was known for his work with injured animals, often rehabilitating them for release. Could this bobcat be one of his Stella's behavior, suggested intent? She wasn't fleeing humans but approaching them, as if pleading for attention. Laura hesitated, her vow clashing with a gut feeling. "She's trying to tell us something," David said, his voice low. "Look at her. She keeps moving toward the forest, then back to the road." Laura watched Stella's pattern a sprint toward the trees, a pause, then a return to the asphalt, her eyes locking onto the humans. It was unnatural, deliberate, against her better judgment. Laura felt a spark of trust in the animal's urgency. All right, she said, her voice firm but laced with doubt. Let's see where she leads us. They followed Stella into the park's edge, where the terrain grew wilder, thorny mesquite and tangled underbrush closing in. Laura's hand rested on her holster, not for Stella, but for the unknown. Fortress Ridge was vast, its trails treacherous, and a missing hiker could mean anything from a sprained ankle to something far worse. Stella moved with purpose, her injured leg barely slowing her. Though Laura noticed a slight limp, the Bobcat's determination stirred something in her, a flicker of admiration. Maybe even hope. But hope was dangerous. It had led her astray before. As they ventured deeper, the path narrowed, the air thick with the scent of cedar and earth. Stella paused suddenly, her ears flattening. A dry rattle cut through the silence, a rattlesnake, coiled on the trail, its diamond-patterned body blending with the dirt. Laura froze, her heart pounding. Stella, fearless, lunged at the snake, not to attack but to distract, her claws swiping the air. The snake struck, grazing Stella's leg, and she yelped, stumbling back. Laura's training kicked in. She grabbed her first aid kit, her hands shaking as she approached the bobcat. Stella, panting, didn't resist as Laura carefully bandaged the shallow wound, her fingers brushing the coarse fur. The act felt intimate, a bridge between her world and Stella's. "You're tougher than you look," Laura whispered, her voice barely audible. David nodded approvingly. "She's fighting for something, someone." They pressed on, Stella limping but undeterred, leading them past jagged limestone and through a grove of live oaks. The forest grew denser, the light dimming as the sun dipped lower. Laura's flashlight caught fresh boot prints in the dirt Thomas's. David confirmed, matching the tread in his file. Nearby, signs of a struggle emerged, a torn backpack strap, a water bottle half buried in leaves, and faint streaks of dried blood on a rock. Laura's chest tightened, the fawn's memory clawing at her again. Had she misjudged this? Was she leading them into danger? But Stella's urgent yowls pulled her forward, toward a ravine where the bobcat paced frantically, her eyes fixed on something below. Laura peered over the edge, her breath catching. There, half hidden by shadows, was a man Thomas Reed pinned beneath a fallen tree, his face pale, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. He was alive, but barely. Stella had done what no human could. She'd found him. Laura's heart raced, not with fear now, but with a fragile, unfamiliar hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could get this one right. The ravine's edge was a jagged scar in the earth, its depths cloaked in shadows that seemed to swallow the fading daylight. Laura Bennett crouched, her flashlight beam cutting through the dusk, illuminating Thomas Reed's pale face below. He lay pinned beneath a massive oak, its gnarled branches pressing into his chest. His left leg bent at a sickening angle. His breathing was shallow, his eyes fluttering with pain and exhaustion. But he was alive, a miracle in itself after 3 days in the wilds of Fortress Ridge State Park. Stella, the young bobcat, paced anxiously at Laura's side, her golden eyes locked on Thomas, her low yowls vibrating with urgency. Dr. David Carter, the wildlife biologist, knelt beside Laura, assessing the scene with a practiced eye. "He's in bad shape," David murmured, his voice steady but grim. "That tree's holding him down, and he's dehydrated. We need to move fast." Laura nodded, her mind racing. The memory of the fawn she'd failed years ago gnawed at her, but she shoved it down, focusing on the present. This wasn't about her past mistakes. It was about saving Thomas. She radioed for a rescue team, her voice clipped and authoritative, relaying coordinates and the need for medical and extraction equipment. Dispatch confirmed a team was en route, but the ravine's remoteness meant at least an hour's wait, an hour Thomas might not have. Stella's restless pacing intensified, her injured leg, bandaged from the rattlesnake encounter, dragging slightly as she circled the ravine's lip. Laura watched her, marveling at the bobcat's resolve. The blue emergency locator device strapped to Stella's hind leg, TM-7734, Thomas's beacon, had been no accident. David had explained on the trek that Thomas, a wildlife rehabilitator, often worked with animals like Stella, training them to trust humans enough to coexist. But this was extraordinary. Stella had sought out the highway, risking her life to draw attention, to lead them here. Laura's chest tightened with a mix of awe and responsibility. She couldn't let Stella's courage be in vain. David scrambled partway down the ravine's slope, testing the loose limestone and tangled roots for stability. "The tree's unstable," he called up. "If we shift it wrong, it could crush him." Laura joined him, her boots slipping on the shale as she descended. The air in the ravine was cooler, heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine. Thomas's eyes flickered open as they approached, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Stella, she found you." His words were faint, but they carried a weight that hit Laura like a punch. She knelt beside him, her first aid training taking over. His pulse was weak, his skin clammy. She pulled a water bottle from her pack, gently tilting it to his lips. He sipped, coughing, his gaze drifting to Stella above. "Good girl," he rasped, a ghost of a smile crossing his cracked lips. Laura's throat tightened. She wanted to ask how he'd survived, how Stella had known to seek help, but there was no time. David examined the tree, its roots exposed from a recent storm, likely the same one that had trapped Thomas. "Lightning probably brought it down," David said, pointing to charred bark. "He's lucky it didn't kill him outright." Laura noticed a makeshift splint on Thomas's leg, strips of his shirt tied around a branch, evidence of his resourcefulness. Scattered nearby were his belongings, a cracked compass, a torn map, and a small knife, its blade dulled from cutting the fabric. Signs of a struggle surrounded them, broken branches, scuffed earth, and more dried blood, suggesting Thomas had fought to free himself before exhaustion won. Laura's mind flashed to her own struggle, the fawn's panicked eyes haunting her. She'd been too eager then, too emotional. Now, she forced herself to stay clinical, assessing Thomas's injuries. His leg was likely fractured, and the pressure from the tree risked internal damage. She applied a compress to a gash on his arm, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. Stella's yowls grew sharper, almost impatient, as if urging them to hurry. Laura glanced up, meeting the Bobcat's gaze. "We're trying, Stella," she whispered, surprised by her own words. David rigged a makeshift pulley using rope from his pack, looping it around a sturdy trunk above to lift the tree. Laura assisted, her muscles straining as they worked to shift the weight. The oak creaked ominously, and Thomas groaned, his face contorting in pain. "Hold on," Laura said, her voice firm but gentle. "We've got you." The tree budged an inch, then two, but the slope's instability sent rocks tumbling, forcing them to pause. David cursed under his breath. "We need the rescue team's gear for this." Laura's heart sank, but she refused to give up. She climbed back to the ravine's edge, checking her radio. The team was still 40 minutes out. Stella nudged her leg, her fur brushing Laura's hand, and for a moment, the Bobcat's warmth grounded her. She remembered bandaging Stella's wound earlier, the trust in the animal's stillness. That trust now fueled her resolve. Returning to Thomas, Laura kept him talking, asking about Stella to keep him conscious. His voice, though weak, lit up as he spoke. "Raised her from a cub," he said. "Her mother was killed by poachers. Stella? She's special. Trained her to find roads if she needed help." He coughed, wincing when the tree fell. "I tied my beacon to her harness. Hoped she'd remember." His words trailed off, but the pride in his eyes was unmistakable. Laura's admiration for both man and Bobcat deepened. Thomas's ingenuity and Stella's loyalty were a testament to a bond she'd once dismissed as impossible. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the only sounds Thomas's labored breathing and Stella's soft cries. Laura noticed a faint scar on Thomas's hand, a crescent-shaped mark, and he caught her gaze. "Stella's mother," he said faintly, "scratched me when I tried to save her. Stella's all I have left of her." The story stirred something in Laura, a pang of guilt for her own lost faith in the wild. She'd seen animals as unpredictable, but Stella was rewriting that narrative. As they waited, Laura scanned the ravine, noticing claw marks on the tree Stella's, likely from her attempts to free Thomas. The Bobcat hadn't just sought help, she'd fought for him, her small body defying the odds. Laura's resolve hardened. She wouldn't let this story end in tragedy. David rigged a temporary brace to stabilize the tree. Buying time, Laura kept monitoring Thomas, her training keeping her calm even as her heart raced. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that made the ravine feel like a tomb. Stella's pacing grew frantic, her eyes darting to the horizon as if sensing the rescue team's approach. Laura placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, her voice steady. "They're coming. Thomas, Stella got us this far. We're not giving up." He nodded weakly, his hand twitching as if reaching for Stella. Laura looked up at the Bobcat, her silhouette framed against the twilight. For the first time in years, Laura felt a flicker of belief, not just in Stella, but in herself. The past wasn't her future this time. She'd make it right. The ravine's shadows deepened as the Texas sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and bruised purple. Laura Bennett knelt beside Thomas Reed, her flashlight's beams steady on his ashen face, his breath shallow but persistent. The fallen oak pinning him creaked under its own weight, a grim reminder of the ticking clock. Dr. David Carter worked tirelessly above, securing the makeshift pulley system, his hands deft despite the strain etched into his weathered features. Stella, the young bobcat, perched on the ravine's edge, her golden eyes glinting with an almost human intensity, her bandaged leg trembling as she watched Thomas. Her low, plaintive yowls cut through the cooling air, a haunting chorus that kept Laura's nerves taut. The rescue team was still 20 minutes out, their ETA crackling through Laura's radio like a lifeline she couldn't quite grasp. She adjusted the compress on Thomas's arm, her fingers brushing the crescent-shaped scar he'd mentioned Stella's mother's mark, a relic of a failed rescue that mirrored Laura's own haunting memory of the fawn. That failure had hardened her, made her distrust the fragile bridge between human and wild. But Stella's relentless courage was chipping away at that wall. Thomas's eyes fluttered, his voice a faint rasp. She never gave up. Stella kept coming back. Laura nodded, her throat tight. She glanced up at the bobcat, whose pacing had slowed, as if sensing the urgency of the moment. Laura's mind churned. Protocol demanded she wait for the professionals, but every second risked Thomas slipping away. She looked at David, his face slick with sweat as he tested the rope. "Can we lift it enough to ease the pressure?" she asked. Her voice low but firm. David frowned, assessing the tree's weight. "Maybe, but it's risky. One wrong move, and it could shift onto him." Laura's gaze darted to Thomas's leg, the makeshift splint of torn fabric and branch, a testament to his will to survive. The dried blood on the rocks, the scattered compass and knife, told a story of a man who'd fought against the odds, just as Stella had fought to bring them here. Laura's heart pounded, the memory of the fawn's panic at flight flashing in her mind. She'd been too reckless then, too emotional. But this time, she felt a clarity born of Stella's trust, a trust that had led them to this ravine. "We have to try," she said. Meeting David's eyes, he nodded, understanding the stakes. They worked in tandem, Laura bracing the tree's base while David pulled the rope, their muscles straining against the oak's stubborn mass. The tree groaned, lifting an inch, then two, and Thomas gasped, his face contorting in pain. Laura's stomach twisted, but she held steady, whispering, "Hang on, Thomas, we're with you." Above, Stella's yowls grew sharper, almost as if she sensed the shift. The tree settled slightly, easing the pressure on Thomas's chest, and his breathing steadied, if only marginally. Laura checked his pulse, weak but there. She poured more water over his lips, her hands steady despite the adrenaline surging through her. David wiped his brow, his voice low. "That bought us some time, but not much. The team needs to hurry." Laura nodded, her eyes scanning the ravine for anything they'd missed. Her flashlight caught a glint, a small, weathered journal half buried in the dirt near Thomas's outstretched hand. She retrieved it, its pages crinkled and stained with mud. Flipping it open, she found Thomas's handwriting, hurried but legible, detailing his work with Stella, day 47. Stella learned to associate roads with safety. If lost, she'll seek them out. Smartest bobcat I've ever known. Another entry, dated days before his disappearance. Read storm coming, taking Stella to Fortress Ridge for release prep. Her mother's strength lives in her. Laura's chest tightened. The journal wasn't just a log. It was a love letter to Stella, to the wild, to a life dedicated to bridging worlds. She tucked it into her pack, a silent promise to return it to Thomas when he was safe. Stella's sudden movement drew her attention. The Bobcat had descended partway into the ravine, her claws digging into the shale as she neared Thomas. She nuzzled his hand, her rough tongue brushing his fingers, and he stirred, murmuring, "Good girl, Stella." The sight pierced Laura, stirring a warmth she hadn't felt in years. She'd spent so long blaming herself for the fawn, believing humans and wildlife could never coexist without harm. But here was Stella, defying that belief, her loyalty a beacon in the dark. David climbed back up to check the pulley, his eyes scanning the horizon for the rescue team's lights. Laura stayed with Thomas, her voice soft but steady as she kept him talking. "Tell me about Stella's mother," she said, hoping to keep him conscious. Thomas's eyes, glazed with pain, flickered with memory. She was fierce, found her caught in a poacher's trap, leg nearly gone, tried to save her, but infection took her. Stella was just a cub, eyes barely open. "I raised her, taught her to survive." His voice cracked. "She's my family." Laura swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling into her. She glanced at Stella, who'd returned to the ravine's edge, her silhouette sharp against the twilight. The Bobcat's determination mirrored Thomas's, a shared resilience that Laura envied. She'd locked away her own emotions after the fawn, fearing they'd cloud her judgment. But now they surged, urging her to act, to trust. A distant rumble broke her thoughts, the rescue team's vehicle. Finally approaching, headlights pierced the dusk, and Laura's radio crackled with confirmation. "ETA 5 minutes, the voice said. Relief flooded her, but she didn't relax. She and David worked to stabilize Thomas further, securing a blanket over him to combat shock. Stella paced faster, her yowls softening into a low, almost hopeful hum. Laura noticed fresh claw marks on the tree, deeper than before, as if Stella had returned to it repeatedly, clawing in vain to free Thomas. The image seared into Laura's mind, a tiny creature fighting a giant, refusing to surrender. As the rescue team descended with stretchers and hydraulic tools, Laura stepped back, giving them space. The team's leader, a paramedic named Clara, assessed Thomas quickly, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Fractured femur, possible internal bleeding," she said. "We'll lift the tree and get him out." Laura watched, her heart in her throat, as the team positioned their equipment. Stella hovered close, her eyes never leaving Thomas. When the tree finally lifted, a collective breath escaped the group. Thomas groaned, but the paramedics moved swiftly, stabilizing his leg and sliding him onto a stretcher. Stella followed, her limp more pronounced, yet she stayed near, her presence a quiet anchor. As the team carried Thomas up the ravine, Laura caught his gaze. "Stella, take care of her," he whispered. Laura nodded, her voice steady. "We will. Thomas, she's a hero." Stella trailed the stretcher, her head low, as if guarding him still. Laura followed, her boots heavy on the shale, the weight of the moment settling into her bones. The fawn's memory lingered, but it felt different now, less a wound, more a lesson. Stella had shown her something she'd forgotten: trust could bridge even the wildest divides. As the team loaded Thomas into the ambulance, Laura looked at Stella, her tawny fur glowing under the rescue lights. The Bobcat met her gaze, and for a moment, Laura felt seen, understood. The night closed around them, but the hope Stella carried burned brighter than the stars. The ambulance's red lights pulsed through the twilight, casting a surreal glow over the rugged terrain of Fortress Ridge State Park as it sped toward the highway. Laura Bennett stood at the ravine's edge, her boots caked with limestone dust, her heart still racing from the rescue. Thomas Reed was stabilized, strapped to a stretcher inside the ambulance, his fractured leg splinted and his vitals monitored by Clara. The paramedic, Dr. David Carter, stood beside Laura, his face etched with relief but shadowed by concern for the young Bobcat. Stella, who lingered near the ambulance's open doors. Her tawny fur was matted with dirt, her bandaged leg trembling from the rattlesnake graze, yet her golden eyes remained fixed on Thomas, her low yowls softening into a mournful hum. The rescue team had moved with precision, lifting the fallen oak and extracting Thomas in under 10 minutes. But the sight of Stella pacing after the stretcher had seared itself into Laura's mind. The Bobcat's loyalty, her refusal to abandon Thomas. stirred a warmth in Laura that she hadn't felt since her rookie days, before the fawn's death had hardened her against hope. Now, as the ambulance doors closed, Laura felt a pang of responsibility not just for Thomas, but for Stella, who had risked everything to save him. David knelt beside the Bobcat, his voice gentle. "You did good. Girl, he's safe now." Stella's ears twitched, but she didn't move, her gaze locked on the fading taillights. Laura crouched too, her hand hovering near Stella's fur, hesitant to cross the invisible line between human and wild. "What happens to her now?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with unease. David sighed, rubbing his weathered hands together. "Thomas raised her, but she's still a wild animal. She's not fully releasable, yet too used to humans. I'll take her to the Austin Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. They'll care for her until Thomas recovers." Laura nodded, her eyes tracing the blue emergency locator device still strapped to Stella's hind leg, TM7734, Thomas's beacon. The key that had led them here. She thought of his journal, tucked safely in her pack, its pages filled with notes about Stella's training, her mother's death, and Thomas's devotion to the wild. The weight of that devotion pressed on her now, a reminder of the bond she'd once dismissed as impossible. The rescue team's vehicles were dispersing, their lights fading into the night, leaving Laura and David with Stella and the quiet of the forest. The air was cooler now, the scent of cedar and earth mingling with the faint tang of diesel. Laura's radio crackled with updates. Thomas was en route to Austin General Hospital. Critical but stable. She should have felt relief, but Stella's restless pacing kept her tethered to the moment. The Bobcat's limp was more pronounced, her injury from the rattlesnake worrying Laura. "We need to check her wound," she said, her training kicking in. David nodded, pulling a small medical kit from his Jeep. Together, they coaxed Stella closer, her trust in humans honed by Thomas making her surprisingly compliant. Laura held her flashlight steady as David carefully unwrapped the bandage, revealing a shallow but inflamed gash. "It's not deep, but it needs cleaning," David said, applying antiseptic with practiced care. Stella flinched but didn't pull away, her eyes flicking between them and the road where Thomas had vanished. Laura's fingers brushed Stella's fur, and she felt a jolt of connection, a fragile bridge to the wild she'd long feared. "She's tougher than she looks," Laura murmured, echoing her words from the forest. David smiled faintly, like her mother. From what Thomas said, that scar on his hand, her mother fought to protect Stella, even in her final moments. Laura's chest tightened, the parallel to her own past striking deep. She'd failed the fawn, but Stella was different. This time, she'd acted, trusted her instincts, and it had made a difference. As David rebandaged Stella's leg, Laura's mind drifted to the journal's entries. Thomas had written about a storm, the one that likely felled the oak, and his plan to prepare Stella for release. But there was something else, a note about Stella's mother. How she'd clawed him not out of malice but fear, trying to shield her cub. Laura understood that fear now, the instinct to protect, to fight against the odds. She glanced at Stella, who'd settled onto the ground, her body curled protectively as if guarding an invisible Thomas. The Bobcat's resilience was a mirror to Laura's own, a reminder that second chances were possible. David stood, wiping his hands. "We need to get her to the center tonight. They've got a vet on call, and Thomas would want her safe." Laura agreed, but the thought of separating Stella from Thomas, even temporarily, felt wrong. She remembered Thomas's whispered plea in the ravine, "Take care of her." She looked at David, her voice firm. "I'll ride with you. I want to make sure she's okay." David raised an eyebrow but didn't argue, sensing the shift in her. They loaded Stella into a crate in David's Jeep, her protest soft but poignant as she pressed her nose against the bars. The drive to Austin was quiet, the highway stretching dark and empty under a star-strewn sky. Laura sat in the passenger seat, the journal in her lap, its weight grounding her. He flipped it open again, reading by the dashboard's glow. Thomas had written about Stella's cognition, her ability to recognize patterns, to seek help. One entry stood out. "Stella watches me like she knows my soul. If I'm ever lost, she'll find a way." Laura's throat tightened. Stella had done exactly that, defying her wild nature to save him. At the Austin Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, the night staff greeted them, a veterinarian named Dr. Elena Ruiz taking charge of Stella. The facility was a haven of enclosures and medical suites, its air humming with the soft sounds of recovering animals. Elena examined Stella, confirming the rattlesnake bite was minor but required monitoring. "She's stressed but strong," Elena said, her hands gentle as she cleaned the wound. "This one's a fighter." Laura watched Stella settle into a temporary enclosure, her eyes still searching, as if expecting Thomas to appear. David spoke with Elena about Thomas's work, explaining Stella's role in his rehabilitation program. Laura listened, piecing together the depth of their bond. Thomas had raised Stella after her mother's death, teaching her to navigate a world where humans and wildlife often clashed. Yet Stella had transcended that divide, her actions on Highway 281 a testament to trust, not fear. As they left the center, Laura felt a shift within her. The fawn's death had taught her to guard her heart, but Stella's courage had cracked that armor. She thought of Thomas's scar, a mark of failure turned into a symbol of love for Stella. Laura carried her own scars, but maybe they, too, could mean something more. Driving back to her patrol car, she glanced at David. "You think Stella knew exactly what she was doing?" "Seeking the road, leading us to him." David's eyes crinkled with a knowing smile. "I've seen a lot of animals." "Laura, most don't do what she did. That wasn't just instinct, it was loyalty." Laura nodded, the words settling into her like a promise. Stella had bridged the wild and human worlds, and Laura was determined to honor that bridge. As the stars burned above, she felt a spark of hope, fragile but real, that she could trust again, not just in Stella, but in herself. The Texas sun dipped low over Austin, its golden rays spilling across the newly unveiled Texas Wildlife Ambassador Center, a sprawling facility of glass and stone nestled on the city's outskirts. 6 months had passed since the dramatic rescue on Highway 281, and the air buzzed with anticipation as a crowd gathered for the grand opening. Laura Bennett stood near the entrance, her Texas Department of Public Safety uniform crisp, but her posture softer than it had been that fateful day. The memory of Stella, the young Bobcat, pacing defiantly on the highway lingered in her mind, as did the ravine where they'd found Thomas Reed, pinned but alive, thanks to Stella's courage. That moment had shifted something in Laura, thawing the guilt she'd carried since the fawn's death years ago now. As she scanned the crowd, families, conservationists, and reporters, she felt a quiet pride, not just in Stella, but in her own role in the story that had captured national attention. The centerpiece was Stella's enclosure, a sprawling habitat of native grasses, limestone outcrops, and a trickling stream designed to mimic Fortress Ridge State Park. Beyond it, educational displays lined the pathways, each one celebrating the bond between humans and wildlife. Laura's eyes drifted to a mural on the main building's wall, a vivid depiction of Stella on Highway 281, her tawny fur glowing under the sun. Her gaze leading into a forest that seemed to pulse with life. Beneath it, a stone plaque bore an inscription. "A letter from Thomas. Stella taught me that loyalty and hope light the way. She saved me and reminded us of the wondrous stories between humans and nature." Laura's throat tightened as she read it, her fingers brushing the badge on her chest. She hadn't just been a bystander in this story. She'd been part of its heart. Thomas Reed, now recovered but still using a cane, approached her, his smile warm despite the faint limp in his step. Beside him was Dr. David Carter, his weathered face creased with a grin as he gestured toward the enclosure. "She's waiting for you," Thomas said, his voice steady but rich with gratitude. Laura followed them, her boots clicking on the stone path. The crowd parted, their murmurs fading as they reached the observation glass. There was Stella, lounging on a sun-warmed rock, her fur sleek, her bandaged leg now healed, though a faint scar remained from the rattlesnake's graze. Her golden eyes locked onto Laura, and a flicker of recognition passed between them, a rare trait for a bobcat. David had said. Laura's breath caught. She'd visited Stella often over the past months, each time feeling that same spark of connection, a bridge she'd once thought impossible. Thomas leaned on his cane, his eyes bright. "She knows you." "Laura always has." He gestured to the enclosure, where Stella rose, stretching with a grace that belied her wildness. "This place, it's her legacy, And yours. Laura's chest swelled, the weight of his words settling into her. The center had been funded by donations that poured in after Stella's story spread. A viral tale of a bobcat who defied nature to save her human. Thomas and David had spearheaded the Wildlife Ambassadors program, with Stella as its first emblem, educating the public on conservation and the delicate dance between human and wild. Laura had been skeptical at first, her old doubts about such harmony lingering. But seeing Stella now, thriving yet still connected to them, she felt those doubts dissolve. Thomas led her to a smaller exhibit, a tribute to Stella's mother. A bobcat killed by poachers. A photograph showed her fierce eyes, so like Stella's, and beside it, a plaque announced a scholarship fund in her name, supporting young conservationists. It's what she'd have wanted, Thomas said softly, his hand tracing the crescent-shaped scar on his palm. Stella carries her spirit, and now others will too. Laura nodded, thinking of the journal she'd returned to him, its pages filled with love for Stella and her mother. That love had built this place, a testament to second chances Thomas's, Stella's, and her own. David joined them, his voice low but animated. We've got plans to expand. More enclosures, more education programs. Stella's story showed people what's possible when we listen to the wild. He gestured to the crowd, where children pressed against the glass, watching Stella with awe. Laura smiled, a rare softness breaking through her usual reserve. She'd spent years believing her failure with the fawn defined her. But Stella had rewritten that narrative, showing her trust could heal old wounds. As the ceremony began, Thomas took the stage, his cane tapping lightly. He spoke of Stella, of the storm that trapped him, of her bravery in seeking help. She wasn't just a bobcat, he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. She was my family, my hope. He paused, his eyes finding Laura. And she had help. Officer Bennett, Dr. Carter, they believed in her when it mattered most. The crowd applauded, and Laura felt heat rise to her cheeks. She wasn't used to praise, but she stood taller, her hand resting on the journal in her pocket, a keepsake Thomas had insisted she keep. After the speeches, Laura approached the enclosure again. Stella had moved closer, her nose inches from the glass. The crowd had thinned, leaving a quiet moment between them. Laura pressed her hand against the glass, and Stella, in a gesture that stunned the remaining onlookers, raised her paw, mirroring her. Thank you. Stella, Laura whispered, tears prickling her eyes. You changed our world. The bobcat's gaze held hers, steady and knowing, as if acknowledging the bond they'd forged. Laura thought of the fawn, its panicked eyes no longer a weight, but a reminder of how far she'd come. She'd trusted Stella, trusted herself, and that trust had saved a life. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the mural, Laura felt a peace she hadn't known in years. The center buzzed with life volunteers guiding visitors, children sketching Stella's likeness, and conservationists planning the next steps. David joined her, his eyes on the horizon. You ever think about joining us here? We could use someone like you, someone who gets it. Laura smiled, the idea sparking something new in her. Maybe, she said, her voice soft but open. She looked at Stella, now curled on her rock, her presence a quiet anchor. The mural's colors deepened in the sunset. Stella's painted gaze leading into the forest, a symbol of hope and resilience. Laura's hand lingered on the glass, the memory of Stella's paw against it etched into her heart. The wild and human worlds had collided here, not in conflict, but in harmony. And Laura was no longer afraid of that bridge. She thought of Thomas's words in the plaque, loyalty and hope light the way. Stella had lit that way for her, for Thomas, for countless others who'd come to this center inspired by her story. As the stars began to emerge, Laura took a deep breath, the scent of cedar and possibility filling her lungs. She wasn't just an officer anymore. She was part of something bigger. A story that would live on in every paw print, every heart touched by Stella's courage. The Bobcat's legacy was just beginning, and Laura knew she'd carry it with her, always.